And now, the presidential spokesperson 36A. They fired? Presidential spokesperson 36B. They fired too? Well, just tell me who here. And now, presidential spokesperson 36D.
Welcome, lying liberal media. I am here to tell you about what you saw in the testimony of former FBI Director James Comey. Liar, liar, and leaker and not the good kind. Also, FBI Director James Comey said that President Donald J. Trump did nothing wrong, has not colluded with the Russians, never done anything wrong. Why have you not been reporting on this? Fox News is reporting on this. The real media, Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, all having quotes from James Comey's testimony that say Donald J. Trump did nothing wrong. Oh, I know, you're out there, you're going to say, I know, you say, he didn't actually say that. They made up the quotes. Just like you. He could have said that. He could have said that just as easily as he could have said what you said he said just because it's what he said. Think about that. He could have said it. Also, he said that President Donald J. Trump's inauguration was the most attended inauguration ever. Finally, Roger Ailes, the founder of Fox News, is dead. Why are you not reporting on Hillary Clinton's role in the possible murder of Roger Ailes, who had lots of nasty things to say about Hillary Clinton? Some of them true. Where is the special counsel, Robert Mueller, Mr. Big Shot? Why is he not investigating Hillary Clinton's role in the murder of Roger Ailes? Thank you. No questions.
It's time for Forward Nation Radio. Now here he is, the host of Forward Nation Radio, David Leventhal.
Welcome to Forward Nation Radio. Thank you for joining us as always. A little bit of a different treat for you today. You're not going to hear me drone on about our usual format. We're going to have news, and then we've got a special treat, Dr. Joseph Nathan Cohen, author of The Financial Crisis in American Households, The Basic Expenses That Bankrupt the Middle Class. And a professor at Queens College of the University of New York will be here to talk about his book and his research on the problems and obstacles confronting the middle class and others in America. And we look forward to having Dr. Cohen on the show in a few minutes. But first, we will spend a little bit of time on the news. Starting off right hot off the presses, the latest news today, you've probably already heard about the shooting of House Majority Whip Steve Scalise while playing softball. Obviously, our best wishes go out to him and his family. So, how is this relevant? What do we learn about this? Well, obviously, we're worried about and we are hesitant to politicize this. We can certainly expect that it will be politicized tremendously, particularly on the right. I assume that Fox News at this very moment is running reports about how much better things would have been if the softball players had been armed themselves. A good way to stop someone shooting at you. Also, by the way, a good way to stop hard slides into second base. So what do we learn, though? What should we take out of this shooting incident? And I will look for something, again, worried about politicizing it, but nevertheless looking for lessons that we can draw from this. Well, also in the news recently is that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has unanimously upheld Donald Trump's travel ban. Well, we know that the typical reaction from the White House, although this has been slightly more muted than the previous one, somebody must have taken away little boy's cell phone, has been that the courts cannot be trusted and to delegitimize the courts. So how do these two things relate to each other? How does the Ninth Circuit decision pertain to the shooting? Well, what we have to prevent anarchy, to prevent people trying to take the law into their own hands, and yes, at this point it does look like the shooter was someone on the left who was disappointed in Republicans and the Trump administration. Obviously, what he did was tremendously inappropriate, and not to make excuses for it. We have the rule of law so that people do not do things like take the law into their own hands. We don't engage in terrorist acts because we have recourse under the law to get justice. This is why discussions attacking our legal system, our criminal justice system, are so dangerous to the very fabric of democracy. If people cannot get justice in a court of law or in the political sphere, and again, I want to stress that that is not the case here, where there is obviously a political solution to the Trump administration. But to the extent that we do limit these protections and roll them back, you can expect to see more violent acts in America. We are reluctant to refer to this as terrorism, though I'm not sure exactly why. Perhaps from the media perspective in general, terrorism right now involves an Islamist as a perpetrator, and we don't have that here. But whether or not this qualifies as terrorism, you clearly do not want to see Americans who feel the need to take the law into their own hands. And again, while that is not the case here, that he felt that he had to do that, it is important to protect the rule of law. It is important to protect the integrity of our court system, our justice system, and yes, our investigations. Yeah, more on that in a few moments. Also, very recently in the news, why is it that every week we need to send our condolences out to the City of London? This time, they were victimized not by a terrorist attack. The City of London was victimized by a fire, by an accident, an act of God, as you would. Well, why is this relevant? How do we make this something we can learn from, as we always seek to do on this show? Well, again, information is still being gleaned in this case, but already it appears that one of the problems with the London fire, right now the death toll before we went to press today, so to speak, the death toll was up to 12, might climb even higher, with a lot of people injured. Turns out that the fire alarms did not ring. Investigators perhaps will be looking into figuring out how many people could have avoided injury, lessened injury, and perhaps even avoided death if the fire alarms had worked properly, if there was a functioning sprinkler system. We'll be investigating, I hope, whether the building was made as fireproof as it should have been made. What should we learn from this? We Americans are scared to death of terrorism. The London attack last week, that was a terrorist attack and resulted in, I believe the number is still at 6 deaths. Got tremendous media play and once again scared Americans out of leaving their own homes. I know, as I expect most of you know, somebody who will not appear at big public demonstrations, public rallies, public events for fear of terrorism. And yet the irony here is your chance of dying from a workplace safety accident because workplace safety rules are either not being implemented or not being enforced in some respects is far greater, many times greater than the possibility that you're going to die in a terrorist attack. The possibility of you dying because of a fire in a building that does not meet fire codes or does not have to meet sufficient fire codes is many, many times greater than the possibility that you will die as a result of terrorism. Nevertheless, The fear of terrorism changes our behavior. Do we refuse to enter tall buildings? Will we refuse to rent an apartment on a high floor? Actions that may have far greater impact in protecting your safety than staying away from mass rallies out of fear of terrorism. Obviously, the Trump administration is hell-bent on deregulation, on starving our public agencies of the funds they need to impose the proper regulations to ensure the safety of citizens and of workers, and then to make sure that those laws and regulations are being followed. It is not unfair to say, and for you to be clear on, that if we reduce the regulatory state, if we take away from the enforcement of regulations to protect worker and citizen safety, we will have more dead Americans. And instances such as this are more likely to occur in America, perhaps other places where they're doing the same. Okay, now, of course, to the big story that you've all been following for almost a week. It's a shame for us when big news happens on a Thursday, and just too late for us to put it into that week's show. But some of you might still recall former FBI Director James Comey's testimony to the United States Senate. By the time we're going to press here, Attorney General Jeff Sessions has also testified in front of the United States Senate. There's not a whole lot to talk about that, other than he doesn't recall a whole lot. And I think, actually, to me, watching the Sessions testimony, the thing that I thought was most interesting was when California Senator and former California Attorney General Kamala Harris asked Attorney General Sessions, who had invoked executive privilege and refused to answer questions many, many times, asked him where that argument that he didn't have to answer a question came from. And he said, well, that's just kind of what they've been telling me. There's a policy somewhere. And she said to him, did you look at the policy? Did you have someone bring to you the policy that you're going to be invoking dozens of times here today? I thought this was a pretty important moment, because you would think that the Attorney General of the United States, before he asserts executive privilege, would have some freaking idea what the policy of the law was that he was relying upon. His answer, of course, was to not answer. But it was clear she kind of threw in there at the last minute when they were pulling the microphone away from her. So the answer is obviously no. You didn't even bother to ask anyone to show you about the law or policy. This, by the way, as a reminder, is the nation's #1 law enforcement officer. Anyway, to the more interesting testimony from former FBI Director James Comey. And this turned out to pretty much be the bombshell that people were hoping and expecting. The former director of the FBI, a man who, let's be clear, as a Clinton supporter and voter, I do have some big problems with the way he did put his thumb on the scale of our election by releasing information that put her email story back into the news at a time when the FBI was investigating Russia interference in our election, and didn't feel the need to mention that the FBI was also investigating some more important things than Hillary Clinton's emails. I have a problem with him. Nevertheless, I have a problem with him being fired. And ultimately, when the former FBI director, who is basically known for his integrity, calls the President of the United States a liar repeatedly, this is pretty earth-shattering. He called the President of the United States a liar, leading a White House spokesperson to come out and say, ha ha ha, obviously the President is not a liar. To which pretty much everybody in the country said, yeah, and obviously so are you. he's an obvious liar. Given the choice between believing James Comey, or believing a congenital liar, the president, obviously most people are going to lean in the direction of James Comey. President of the United States, he testified as a liar, was clearly intruding into the FBI's investigation and trying to squelch it, and knew that what he was doing was wrong, and nevertheless did it. He was, in fact, basically afraid to be in a room alone with him because of how improper it was what the president was doing. Interestingly, James Comey's version of events were subsequently supported by Preet Bharara, former U.S. attorney in Manhattan, who was fired by Trump, coming out and basically saying the same thing, that Donald Trump repeatedly tried to have inappropriate conversations with him, and he also tried to stay away from the president because of his inappropriate interactions with investigators. The other thing that's interesting, of course, from the Comey testimony is the reaction from basically universally in the Republican Party, which is, let's talk about leakers. Can't we talk about something Hillary Clinton did wrong? And I think this is really remarkable. You get to a point, I understand that the Republican Party sold out many years ago. But there needs to be some point at which there's a certain amount of integrity and respect for what it is that you're doing and for the rule of law. And the Republicans basically seem to have none. Immediately rallying around Trump and the administration. You are talking about real allegations of a hostile foreign power interfering with a U.S. election. You would think that any American politician would be outraged by this and want to get to the bottom of it. Instead, in the Republican Party, we see the circling the wagons and putting the party first. Here all the time, we're going to talk in a future show about something called reasoning fallacies that are utilized by people who are trying to deceive you, give you misinformation, and lead you to make bad choices. Well, one reasoning fallacy I want to talk about is a reasoning fallacy that's been in the news a lot lately, something called false equivalency. Even on the podcasts I listen to, people I respect, when you say there is real partisan division in this country, there is a tendency to put your party first, it always has to be followed with, and it's true on both sides. With all due respect, this is bullshit. It may be true on both sides, but it is true overwhelmingly on one side and not the other. Is it true that some Jews in Germany were doing bad things in the 1930s? I would be willing to stipulate that that is true. Nevertheless, we don't say, well, the Nazis were bad, but the Jews were bad too. So, it's kind of a wash. And you need to be careful when people do that. It is one side, not both. A couple of real quick last news items before I bring in Dr. Cohen. We have an experiment, a really remarkable, then I'll go against what I just said, that some Republicans who actually have to govern, and that's people at the state level, actually have a tremendous exercise in right-wing politics right now. Kansas, the state of Kansas, under a ultra-right-wing governor and right-wing legislature over the past several years, has engaged in a right-wing experiment in supply-side economics to improve the state, its finances, and the lives of its citizens by lowering taxes dramatically on the wealthy and cutting social spending. Well, they have been engaging in that experiment for several years. And guess what? Sit down, people, because this is going to knock your socks off. It doesn't work. The economy of Kansas is in the toilet. They are without resources. They've had to drastically cut education funding. They're violating their own constitution in not providing sufficient education to their students. And as a result, the Republican legislature had to pass a tax increase. Goodbye experiment in supply-side right-wing economics. That bill was vetoed by the governor of Kansas, and the Republican legislature just overrode his veto. Okay, we have some more news that will still be news next week, and we will share with you then. In the meantime, I want to make sure that Joe Cohen has plenty of time to get his word out to you, because what he has to say is fascinating. So we'd like to bring Dr. Cohen in at this point, and I think he's on his way.
Thank you,
Joe. Great to see you. Have a seat.
All right, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Financial crisis in American households, the basic expenses that bankrupt the middle class. Tell me what you're talking about.
So what this book is it's a look into the reasons why America's middle class is struggling. And there's been a lot of researchers who have talked about earnings problems that Americans are facing. We know that work has become more precarious. People lose their jobs more easily than they did a generation or two ago. Wages have been stagnating. But what we often ignore is the expenditure side of the ledger. And what this book focuses on is how the American system puts a lot of pressure on American households to spend a lot of money on essential products that are socialized in other advanced economies, like healthcare, like education, childcare, and there's a strange dynamic with housing that pushes people to overspend.
So what are basic necessities in most of the world are creating a financial crisis for much of America?
Yeah, it's preventing people from tightening their belt. And I think a lot of Americans don't see how it affects them, because these forces materialize slowly over a lifetime. What happens is a lot of Americans feel like they're going through a series of what seem like temporary shocks. You go to school and you get into student debt, and you figure, well, I'm going to get into debt now, but I'll dig my way out. And you dig your way out, and then you might have children, and that causes you to, causes a temporary, childcare causes temporary problems, and people think, well, it's not forever, and I'll dig my way out. You send your kids to college, you get that first home. But what these are is they're a series over the course of a lifetime. It's a series of what seem like distinct financial shocks that are a product of a system where the country leaves people responsible for financing these things. And what ends up happening is people find themselves on the cusp of old age, and they haven't been saving because they've been paying down, shock after shock after shock. And we end up with a population that doesn't have much money, is financially vulnerable, is probably going to be dependent on government aid at a time when there's a lot of forces that want to cut government aid to the middle class.
So people basically are going through their lives thinking, one last hill. I'm going to get over this hill, and then everything's going to be fine. And then they're going to get over the hill, and they're going to find there's another hill beyond. They don't expect it.
Yeah, that's right. It's there are identifiable shocks. There's your education, or an individual's education. And then when they move up through the life cycle, there'll be a shock when people have children, and they have to bear the cost of not just bearing a child, but caring for a child. Either that cost will come by somebody being forced to exit the labor market without compensation because there's no maternity leave here, or they'll continue to work and they'll get childcare. There's a lull for a lot of families, when children are old enough to take care of themselves, because those childcare costs, it's not just when children are very young, but public school only goes up to 3 p.m. and the workday certainly doesn't end at 3 p.m. So people have to cover those gaps. People get a little breather when their children are teenagers, and then right when they leave, there's your children's education cost, and then your own healthcare costs are bound to increase at some point.
I think about all these things, spending on basic necessities, and I remember talking about when I was a kid. At the end of the school day, I went out and played in the street with my friends. We went out and played ball. We created our own games. And even that doesn't seem to be the case for many Americans right now when you say there's kind of maybe a lull. I'm at the point, by the way, where I have young kids, and I'm now looking forward to that period where they're going to be old enough and less of an expense. But then I think that, the pressure is on, well, you have to put the kid in Little League because we can't send kids to the street anymore. And so in that sense, too, maybe you have these stresses on people that they don't expect to see.
There's summer camp. What do you do with your children during the summer? The main problem is that there is a system that is indifferent to the demands of childcare. Let me give you a contrasting example. When a family has a child in France, the parents get 6 months of parental leave, paid parental leave, so there's no shock in the first 6 months. And once those 6 months expire, public daycare kicks in. And so what the French have in place is a well-planned sort of system to absorb the shock of having a child, whereas the U.S. system, because it has nothing, it just leaves people to their own devices. And you have people struggling in different ways. Either they're exiting from the labor force, or they're just making do. They're paying out of pocket. Maybe they can afford it, maybe they can't.
But people in France have all this time off. We hear about these socialist European states. They get 6 months off. That must be why we're a lot richer than them, right? I mean, we must be, as a society, a hell of a lot richer. We should be able to afford all these things because we're working a lot harder than they're working.
Well, my view on the contrast in living standards is Americans do have a high material standard of living. America's a great place for stuff. Like when you're, as a Canadian, like when I know my conception of life in America was that it must be so easy to save money because you cross the border and you go to Target or Costco and you see how cheap televisions are and food is and things like that. The problem is that the costs of being an American are not in the material consumption. They're in the essential services, and that's something that I think foreigners don't understand when they're moving here. My friends aren't putting money aside for their kids' college right now. Like the idea of a 529 is kind of foreign to people in Ontario because college is like $3,000-$4,000 a year, maybe $5,000 a year. Whereas here it can be in the tens of thousands of dollars. I live in New Jersey, and the public school is $25,000 a year, it's like buying a small house, putting each child through school.
So is it or isn't it that people are buying iPhones?
It is absolutely not that people are buying iPhones. Think of it, you can buy a smartphone for about, let's say 12 hours of minimum wage, the equivalent of 12 hours of minimum wage work. And that cell phone plan is probably, if you get a discount carrier, you could probably get it for about 5 minimum wage hours. And so these are very, very small bills to cover. A lot of consumer electronics are cheap. We live in an era where you can buy a DVD or a Blu-ray player on Black Friday for like $60, $70. The problem is not consumables.
Or in my case, by the way, $30 with Wi-Fi capability.
It's very cheap. And you know what happens is that is an achievement of the market to my mind. Like there are some, in some ways, this free market orthodoxy does work. It works with frivolous goods that we can just say no to, that we're not forced to buy, like a Blu-ray player. We can offshore it, import it from China, or we can get machines to manufacture it. And if it's too expensive, we can comfortably say no, and it's not a big deal. In those types of product markets, free markets have worked very well. Where they fail is in the more labor-intensive stuff that we can't say no to. You can't just opt out of childcare, or in this environment, you can't just opt out of college. You need to spend it. And the ways that capitalism makes things cheap, offshoring and automated production, they just don't seem to work in healthcare, in education, childcare.
Do you know why?
Well, I mean, I can speak, I think, most strongly to education. Part of education is mentorship. People have been trying to automate the higher education industry. We have phenomena like MOOCs and like edX, where everybody's supposed to just watch it.
MOOCs are massive online courses.
Yeah.
What is that? I'm not sure what the other O is.
Yeah, and now I'm blanking too. It's
for those who
basically
are listening,
YouTube University, where you watch. There's one lecturer who delivers the lecture once, and people watch it online. The problem is that education is not just about attending lectures. There's a mentorship aspect that's there. There's sort of a coaching aspect that's involved in a quality education. And quite candidly, I think most parents want their children to be in front of another human being to mentor them and to teach them. If they weren't, then nobody would bother. You could just get online degrees. So they've tried, but it just doesn't work. The same thing, think with long-term care of the elderly, or going to the doctor, or having somebody watch your children. I mean, conceivably, you could get a robot to do it, but I think I'd opt out.
Or you can do it via Skype and have your sister-in-law from Thailand watch your kids while you go to the movies.
Yeah, right. How's you going to stop your kid from trashing your place, though?
She's got to call the cops if something happens.
Yeah, right.
This was for a while a real possibility in my household. It's interesting when you talk about this. You talked about people are losing jobs more than they had in the past. And when I saw you speak about your book a couple weeks ago, and it was fascinating, and it's part of the reason that you're here.
Thank you.
You talked about how incomes have been stagnant for so long. And when you talk about offshoring, outsourcing, that's obviously a lot of the reason, I'm assuming, for both of those things.
Yeah, that's part of it. Some of the earnings problems that Americans are facing, I don't think that they're very political in nature. It's not, they've preceded Trump. It's not Obama's fault. It's not Bush's fault. It might not even be Ronald Reagan's fault. Some of the forces that cause earning problems we might not even want to reverse. Like, for example, globalization. I remember in the early post-war years, globalization was thought to be a vehicle for world peace. We thought if we were to trade with the Chinese or the Russians that we might not go to war. And
what is Thomas Friedman? What does he say? No two countries with the McDonald's have ever entered into a war or something?
Maybe. I don't know if that's true or not, but
it may not be anymore. It's been a few years.
There's something to it, though, I believe, and with automation has been part of it. And I don't think we want to squash all technological advancement. Part of the reason people aren't earning as much money is the population is aging. There's more older households who fewer households, or a smaller proportion, may be working, because or there might be more older people who aren't earning as much. And the decline of pairing. People are getting married less, and the rise in cohabitation isn't offsetting marriage. And single people are among the most financially distressed groups out there. So there's a lot of reasons why people are struggling, and not all. Some of them do have to do with policy. There's been labor market deregulation. They've let minimum wages fall behind living costs and things like that.
Loss of unions.
The decline of unions, things like that. But there are other factors. And then there's also the question of, the good years, the time when America was great, was like the 1950s and 1960s. And the more I think about it, I think that was an anomalous time in American history. Like, the rest of the world was destroyed in World War II. America was still, kind of like the only person left standing.
We'd geared up all our factories. Our productivity was very high. Our capacity was high.
Yeah, and we were growing the government rapidly. Like, the growth of government was a major economic engine in those decades. And I don't know how much of that could go on forever. Eventually, Japan and Europe recovered and became competitive with us. We couldn't have always dominated global industry. And there comes a point when you can't just create growth by building factory after factory. There eventually is oversupply. So there's a lot of reasons why people are struggling on the earnings side.
And what it seems to me that your basic thesis, in some respects, makes the problem much worse than it appears. You hear people saying, well, poor people in America have refrigerators, they have iPhones, so how bad could it be?
Right.
And I guess the answer is if you can't go to the doctor, if you can't educate your children, it's pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think it's a perspective thing. I as a Canadian, not being able to get preventative care it's appalling. It's like denying a child the ability to go to elementary school because their parents can't pay. It's seen in Canada as an essential service, and the idea that someone would be denied it for lack of money seems really awful. But it's completely normal here. It's something that people are just okay with.
You said basically our expectations that we don't know anything better. And that may be why we tolerate a system that leaves people so vulnerable.
Yeah, I think Americans, they don't have experience with, or maybe they just don't have experience with having a strong social safety net under them and understanding how valuable it is. How valuable it is to feel the latitude that you can quit your job and your spouse can still get chemo treatments, or the idea that like you can earn a little bit less money and maybe buy a more modest home in a poorer neighborhood, and that neighborhood isn't completely distressed. It still has a reasonably good school. Or that you don't have to accumulate as much money as possible for fear of saddling your children with a mountain of debt before they even get started in life. Like, these are wonderful things to have if you have them. And I think foreigners, people in other countries, they defend them viciously because they're so valuable.
Bottom line being that when we're talking about rolling back the social safety net, when we're talking about getting rid of Obamacare and replacing it with Trump care that will leave 23 million more Americans, we're moving in the wrong direction. For most Americans.
Yeah, it is moving in a direction that will leave most people in a position of greater hardship. Listen, government cannot solve all of society's problems, but what it can do is it can act as a buffer to ensure that the hardships that we're all facing collectively are not as painful, or the well-being consequences are not as great. And moving away from socializing medicine, just socialism, I think moving away from that is really not going to do regular people much good.
Bottom line, I'm going to have to take issue with something you said, and I hate to do that right before you leave.
No, go ahead.
When I watched you do your presentation, you said, in Canada, I was a conservative.
Yes.
In America, I'm a moderate Democrat.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay, no, it's not. You are not a moderate Democrat. You're a socialist. Live with it.
There is no wealthy country on earth that doesn't have healthy doses of socialism.
America has healthy doses of socialism.
It's just directed towards the elderly primarily. There is a very large social welfare state. It's just that people refuse to call it welfare, although it absolutely is. Social Security is a form of welfare, and that's okay, because welfare is a good thing for society. Social assistance, or all rich countries, all highly developed countries have very, very strong systems of social programs. And when I was a conservative in the 1990s in Canada, we did not have a problem with public medicine. And we did not want people to be spending $25,000 a year on college. We felt like people should take a little piece of the bill, but I don't think anybody in our party was interested in just leaving people without a doctor or things like that. And I find here conservatives are they just don't care.
There's no such equivalent. There's no equivalent of that in Canada.
Yeah.
All right, Joe, there's so much more I want to ask you. Unfortunately, I'm getting a hook right now brought out. We hope that you can come back. We hope that we can talk again. What you are doing is fascinating and obviously extremely important. Dr. Joseph Nathan Cohen, the book is Financial Crisis in American Households, The Basic Expenses That Bankrupt the Middle Class. Thanks for being here. We hope to see you soon. Let's do our wrap up. For all of you, we hope to see you all soon, or at least for you to see us soon. like looking forward, go to forwardnationradio.com. That's forwardnationradio.com and get the full experience. You think I'd be able to do this by memory at this point in time? You'll see the video from this in every episode there and on our YouTube channel as well. Don't miss the next Forward Nation Radio podcast on Podbean, B-E-A-N, that's podbean.com. If you love what you heard, even like what you heard, or even middling about what you heard, please like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Tell your friends, spread the word, Forward Nation Radio. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to Forward Nation Radio with David Leventhal.